Okay. Hello, Excellencies, distinguished professors, thought leaders, academics, policymakers, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to those of us here in New York, a very cold, sub-zero temperature. And so you made the extra effort. We appreciate you being here. A big hello to everyone who is joining us online, either via UN Web TV or joining us using YouTube. I'm Ben Dotse Malo from UN News. I'm serving as your moderator. Today is day number 3, the final day of the 3-day academic conference on Africa, organized by the UN Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. A very, very big thank you from Undersecretary General Christina Duarte and her team to all the distinguished panelists who have taken part in the riveting discussions over the past 2 days. Professor Muna Dulo, we thank you and your team from yesterday, still thought-provoking. And for any one of us who missed any of the panel discussions, please know that the recordings are archived and available for you to access on UN Web TV and also on YouTube in both French and English. In fact, as we are here, those who are joining us online via YouTube, you should have 2 channels in French and English, and we want you to begin to put in the chat any thoughts you have regarding today's sub-theme. On this final day, the sub-theme is From Theory to Action, Leveraging African Scholarship in Policy Development. From Theory to Action. And the roundtable discussion will be followed by a 1-hour interactive session where we are going to be taking the viewpoints, the comments, and the questions of those of us here in Conference Room 2 at UN headquarters, and also of people who are joining online. We want to engage everybody. Everybody is a participant. And once the interactive session is done, we are going to have our convener and our host, Undersecretary General Christina Duarte, to give closing remarks close to 1 p.m., and that would conclude the entire conference. Now, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, my privilege to introduce briefly members of this roundtable discussion. First, Professor Cheryl Hendricks, Executive Director, Institute of Justice for Justice and Reconciliation, and former Executive Director, African Institute of South Africa and Human Sciences Research Council. Professor Hendricks, welcome. Honorable Ronald Reagan Okumu, a former Member of Parliament in Uganda. He was a Member of Parliament until about 2-3 years ago. Then we have, to my immediate left here, Professor Luwam Dira, Assistant Professor of Law, Western New England University. And somewhere on the edge, Professor Toussaint Kafarire Murula, President of the African Studies Association of Africa, Director of Center Arupe, a Center for Research and Formation in Lubumbashi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you for being here, Matondo. And then we have His Excellency Ashraf Swellam, Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs for African Organizations and Communities, and Chairman of the AUDA NEPAD Steering Committee, focal point of Egypt to the African Peer Review Mechanism. Good morning. Sabah al khair. Okay. Then we'll be having Professor Paul Tiyambe Zeleza. He's here. He's walking on the red carpet from the entrance to join us, so bear with him. He's Senior Advisor for Strategic Initiatives and Professor of African Studies at Howard University. In addition, we have two discussants, Ms. Jayashri Wyatt, Chief Education Outreach Section at the Department of Global Communications here at the UN, and Ms. Christina McIlwainey, Chief Operations Officer, UN University Center for Policy Research. My dear friends, brothers and sisters, last but not least, the moderator for this roundtable discussion, a brother from another mother, Professor Kelechi Kalu, Professor of Political Science, University of California, Riverside. Professor Kalu Kedu, it's over to you.
Ndewo. Good morning. Good morning, House.
Good morning.
Wake up. It is truly an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to interact with everyone and to chair this particular panel. All protocols observed. The first day, we dealt with questions of power, justice, and human rights. The second day, the historical contexts and contemporary challenges, the evolution of the evolution of rule of law in Africa. These are important themes. We need to take a step back and think about the source of these ideas, the state itself. And while I appreciate the often phrase African solutions to African problems, we need to be mindful of the fact that most problems Africans are encountering are externally driven with local support. And therefore, any attempt to find a solution to so-called African problems, we will need to think about where those ideas that might help us reduce the wicked problems that we encounter, wicked problems that deal with insecurity across the continent, wicked problems that deal with food insecurity, such that war in Ukraine with Russia causes food shortage in North and Sub-Saharan Africa region. Wicked problems that deal with existing state incapacity to represent us. When we think about law, when we think about human rights, these are state issues. And as you all well know, the African state was not created by Africans. Let me digress just slightly and say, those of you who are familiar with the United States or South Africa, as the case was before the end of apartheid, most Western European countries, the idea of racism, if you think about it very slightly differently, racism is not about excluding the others. It is about protecting what is ours. That's what the whites have done in various European countries, protecting themselves. It's not about us, the outsiders of that forum. What I mean by this is, for Africans, irrespective of where we come from, to think about collaboratively protecting ourselves, generating ideas wherever we can get them, to protect Africans, to protect our resources. Our solutions can come from the West. They can come indigenously, but the strategy always has to be, how do we protect that which is ours across the globe? Africa is at the center of the world. Indeed, to paraphrase Karl Marx, legal minds in the past 2 days, philosophers have only interpreted contemporary Africa in various ways. The point is to change it. These luminaries with me here are capable of providing us ideas on the ways forward, the way to change our current situation into more transformative, practically relevant solutions to various issues, ranging from agriculture, trade, investment, gender issues, human rights, questions of technology, issues of integration. We have the minds here. I would give each person approximately 6 to 8 minutes to share their ideas. And then I want to open it up for conversations because these panelists believe that ideas from all of you might also be helpful in moving us forward. So again, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to moderate this panel. I'll go first to Professor Hendricks. Professor Hendricks, please share your solutions or ideas on the challenges of peace and security across Africa generally, and specifically on the issue of women, peace, and security within the framework of governance, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Also, thank you to Your Excellency Under Secretary General Duarte for the opportunity to be part of the rich conversation that we've been having here over the past 2 days. I want to do something slightly different, Chair. I've been listening for the past 2 days, and I want to just reflect what I've been hearing and my thoughts a little bit about that before relating it to how do we bridge the gap between research and policy, especially with regards to governance, peace, and security. And I don't see women, peace, and security as a separate thing. Women, peace, and security is part of that peace and security agenda, and our challenges are pretty much the same. And so I think I'm framing this discussion around our processes for knowledge productions, the variables and the questions that we now need to be asking ourselves, and how do we translate the research, the knowledge that we are producing into those corridors of power, the policy-making spheres. So over the past 2 days, I think at one level, we have been raising arguments about knowledge production, ideas, ways of being, ways of doing. Our arguments have centered about whose knowledge, about governance, about rule of law has been centered, whose have been erased, who are the bearers of knowledge, who is seen to be human, indeed who is not, who has the right to dignity, etc. And variously of the in academia, we have referred to that as epistemic injustice. And there's been a lot of effort, I think, to center African knowledge systems within the academia once more, much less so in the spaces of policy making and practice. We have been raising the kinds of concerns that we've been speaking about over the last 2 days since the 60s, if not the 50s, Chair. And they're to be found in the work of people like Sheikh Anta Diop, the Pan-African theorists, the rise of the scholars that were working at the University of Dar es Salaam in the 70s and 80s, and our canon, and we have a canon of African scholars, such as Dani Nabudera, Mahmoud Mamdani, even Paul Zeleza, Hautonji, Mafeji, Makandawire, Kwesi Pra, many others who have been rewriting the narrative about Africa and who sought to make visible Africa's contribution to the humanization of the world, as well as to understand why Africa was experiencing the challenges that we now so glibly refer to as governance challenges. I recall Hautonji and Mamdani raising the questions about human rights not being a Western invention decades ago, asking or saying wherever oppression occurs, there is the conception of rights. Hautonji had noted that Europe produced not the thing called human rights, but the discourse around human rights. So for me, then, the big question is, what have we as Africans done with the knowledge that we have produced, Chair? Why does it seem like we are somewhat chasing our tails here? How much are we contributing to the marginalization of our own knowledge? Knowledge is cumulative, and so our challenge is to identify why we see the disruptions in our pursuit of knowledge. There's always been a counter-narrative in Africa, and it just has not received sufficient airtime. How do we then give it the airtime that it deserves? And when we therefore start with knowledge production and how we get that into policy and practice, we need to actually go back and to see how those scholars, those interlocutors for us that actually did have an influence on policymakers in the 80s and 90s, how did they conceptualize the state, the economy, governance, etc., build upon that, where are the gaps now, and how do we take this forward? And so that, for me, is sort of processes around knowledge production and how we actually engage. The second challenge that seemed to occupy us here was trying to address the question around development, how we're reconceptualizing it, from an absence to what's actually happening in our countries, managing our resources, recentering knowledge, rethinking our society, creating alternative systems, and that's linked to my first point. But we seem to be contextualizing it, Chair, just as you have mentioned here, without looking how we got to this. We cannot be speaking about the rule of law and human rights in the absence of speaking about our governance systems, our state formation, our politics, the powers and interests that hold sway on our continent. That is where our challenges lie, Prof. So some of the blame for where we find ourselves, I think, is of our own making. We may have been wrong, but I think our intentions were noble at the time, and here I'm referring to the project of nation-state building that we haven't quite discussed, and the project of democratization. Those are products of modernization. This was what our leaders and our scholars at the time thought was necessary. We all know our colonial states operated with systems of divided rule, indirect rule. We inherited those systems, and the project was then to move beyond them. Again, I'm thinking of phrases by Samora Machel, for the nation to rise, the tribe must die. You remember those? Mamdani, citizen and subject, that the reason we cannot democratize was located in the bifurcation of our states. Some were citizens, those in the rural areas were subject. And the arguments were that we needed to move beyond that. And hence they relegated in this process of nation-state formation and democratization, the customary, quote-unquote, to the margins. It was something that needed to be transcended. And yes, we have rethought that now. But that was the logic at the time, I think it's important to remember, as well as the ethnic mobilization, the divisions, even the attempts to rethink how we coexist within our societies. I think of African socialism, I think of humanism, I think even of one-party state formations. As flawed as these attempts were, they were attempts to produce alternatives, but they could not survive global hegemony of neoliberalism post the late 1980s. So we shifted from those discussions about how we needed to organize our states, how we wanted to coexist, how class, race, ethnicity, culture, structure, material conditions structured our societies, to the wholesale acceptance of particular iterations of what was good governance and what constituted democracy. And they came with pre-populated templates and structures and systems we needed to put in place. So even where there were attempts to do things differently, as expressed, the IMF, the World Bank, other donors really canceled that out. And particularly, they struck at our education systems, having our states disinvest in education. That's a large part of the disruption that we have seen to date. Until things fallen apart again. And so now we are all actually looking for our traditional leaders to attend our meetings and to assist us with fighting crime and GBV and local disputes, etc. The point I'm trying to make is that we have a continent full of ideas. There's no shortage of thought leaders. There's simply no systematic way in which we are harnessing or building on our knowledge and employing it to address our current realities. Our key challenge seems to be one of organization. We are seeing currently, to bring this home to governance and peace and security, an increased number of conflicts on the continent. Our governance challenges persist. There's much less trust in our democratic systems, our processes, our leaders. Our people are much more willing to live under authoritarianism if it gives them the services that they seek, that they thought they were going to get through processes of democratization. Our peace and security architectures can no longer effectively respond to the challenges that we are seeing here. And this is not because of a lack of structures and processes and policies. We've gone out of our way to put those in place. And I do agree, we put in place that African Union. We put in place the policies and declarations, etc. That was there. We didn't have that challenge, but they now cannot respond. And so how did we do that? Because now we sit with a situation where we again need to come back, organize ourselves, get together as researchers, and this is my actual point to make. I'm going to skip a lot of that and say we need to organize the way in which we conduct research first as a collective pursuit, answering particular questions around how do we want to coexist? What are our values and principles that should be leading us? How do we want participation and representation to be occurring to afford us the human dignity that we want? We need to be having, and I remember this, Chair, because I'm a bit old now. I remember this from the days in which research organizations like Cadastre and SAPAS, etc., used to organize us to answer particular questions about the state, about governance, and feed those into policy processes. We do not have that collective form of knowledge any longer. But those in think tanks and those in research institutes are feeding into policymakers. And they're doing so, one, because they cultivate relations, two, because they build those relations of trust, three, because of the way in which they are writing, the forms in which they are writing policy briefs, opinion pieces, etc., that can resonate there. And so within academia, we do have to change where we're seeking to produce. It cannot just be in the journals, and I'm not saying we must now all be writing policy briefs. There is a space for academia that must be kept, but we have to, Chair, think of different ways. And my last point is, right now, there is an opportunity. The African Union has reparations as its theme for next year. Access to justice. And they are struggling with how to conceptualize reparation. I think for those of us here, we can form interdisciplinary teams and we can think about what reparations for whom, for what, how do we want it, etc. Let us start posing what are the questions we need and then see how we can organize ourselves, Your Excellency, to get that research and information to where it needs to land in the African Union and the RICS. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hendricks. We are reminded again that issues impacting our various countries intersect domestically and externally, especially when you think about the state and its relationship with other states. For example, the former colonial entities that were at the foundation of our countries. We're also reminded of the fact that the multi-ethnic nature of various African states are themselves complexly structured and create their own problem. The challenge is, how do we nation build in a way that makes us see that within the state we have inherited, we can indeed collectively work together. Now, in thinking about states and external entities, I now turn to the Right Honorable Reagan Okumu, former parliamentarian from Uganda, to help us think about African state diplomatic relations and how policymakers perhaps can solve problems and challenges. You may want to touch, if you are so inclined to, on questions of investment, trade, and innovation in technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator. The African situation is very complex. By the time of colonialism, our state formations were disrupted. So we didn't go through normal processes to constitute a nation state. Boundaries were created. In the meeting of today, I'm happy that it is organized under the umbrella of the UN. And maybe perhaps we would be thinking of which institutions we should utilize to stabilize Africa. Prior to the Berlin Conference, Africa was dehumanized through slavery for a long period of time. And that is why the Berlin Conference found it easy to sit in Berlin and divide Africa, because the African people could not resist. The human resources had been sold. And today there are so many voices calling for reparation from the West. But where do we, even if this reparation is to be paid, where should it go? And who should it be given to? And who should pay? I think let us not forget that in the process of slavery, we had both the raiders and those who sold slaves and those who became owners of these slaves abroad. And there are countries involved in this. So we should not just focus at the West and say the West must compensate for slavery. The entire Arabia, Persia, and slaves went up to China. Countries like Portugal, Belgium, Britain were involved in slave raids, mainly in the West African areas. In East Africa, Arabia was involved deep inland in slave raiding and trading. So this is the background where Africa found themselves being parceled from Berlin without any strength to resist. And some of the consequences we see today, why decisions are being made behind Africa, is simply because we do not have the strength, the humanity, to even challenge. Perhaps this is an opportune time because of the world changes. Things have changed, that Africa could come together. So I want to look at just two things. The state of Africa, how can the state of Africa collectively rejuvenate itself to stand firm? How can Africa relate with other countries, relate with multilateral organizations in order to have fair relationship with the rest of the world? The biggest challenge we have in Africa today, the moderator mentioned something to do with ethnicity, which has been a problem. Of course, conflict is prone in Africa. But the biggest challenge we have is that we must rejuvenate our ideological grounding as Africans. These ideological grounded were founded during the struggle for independence. And that explains why the struggle for independence and liberation movement in Africa were successful, because Africans were grounded on certain values. And commonly, both the scholars, the policymakers, the politicians came together to fight for independence because they knew what they wanted. Today, we are almost in a disarray. Those values, those Pan-African values, have degenerated. Can we rejuvenate these Pan-African values to collectively mobilize Africa and bring Africa to have a focus? Because Africa, yes, we had our own problems, but during the struggle for independence, I think we were much stronger than we are today. We were much more organized than we are today. That's why we are able to achieve. We are able to negotiate. We are able to engage the external forces. But today, we are being isolated individually. Either Russia invites the African heads of states, and the policies get determined from Moscow because of the aid being given, or the Chinese invite the African heads of state to Beijing, and they say, this is what we have for you. And Africans get the money without a plan. It is not their policy, it is external policies. Then the US invite the Africans, leaders to come here, in the name of African partnership, without any organized demand. Can the scholars help Africa through a Pan-African arrangement to engage the international community? Africa go to negotiate with donors from a very weak point of view. They don't take their interest forward. It is the money that comes and says, this money is for this purpose. I have been in government. It has been a big problem. You find what is the policy of a country may not actually be operationalized, because the donors will come and say, we have money for A, B, C, not for the rest. So the leadership will say, Ministry of Finance, we must change our policy direction. Completely out of context. And that is the practical reality of African challenge today. When we go to Moscow, are we able to negotiate to China? Are we able to negotiate our values and what we want, our choices? We are not able to. And that is why I think if we revamp the Pan-African interest, we can still bring the scholars together to work with the policy makers on values that are tangible, on values that can be identified. Let's look back at where we have transversed. The pro-independence struggles and the post-independent government in Africa were a little bit stronger, but we were sabotaged. Coups, and Africans were created to belong either to Commonwealth. I don't know whether there are any nations called with Commonwealth, but there is an organization with Commonwealth, those who are under the British. Then the Francophone. This again shapes Africa and divides us. We've lost values in the Pan-African movement. We are getting alien values in the Commonwealth and the Francophone states. And these are challenges. I think some of this requires radical response by scholars and policymakers. And sometimes these radical changes may need some timing. And my own understanding and reading of the political world climate today is that the time is now. If we were strong with this Ukraine war, which has caused problems, Africa would be dictating terms today. We would not just be following BRICS. We would not just be following World Bank and other people and being invited and pleading to do this. We would put our foot down and say, this is what we want as Africans. But again, we are being followers at this critical moment. Why? Because we are not united with value as policymakers, and scholars to pursue the interests of the African people. And unless we do that, we shall remain a laughingstock. The Berlin Conference, many more Berlin Conference will be held, and in different forms. And they are now taking place in different forms. Africa sometimes are just invited. You come and attend, as people are being invited to go and attend BRICS. The US wants to meet Africans, and they say, no, we are only selecting. There are some countries which are not democratic. We don't want them here. If you are not a Democrat, you can't come. And that brings me to my last point, that there are challenges within all this, within the world institutions, of dictating what Africa should be. The neoliberal period was very dangerous for Africa. People impose policies on Africa. You must do this in order to get this money. You must do, and some of these measures were very harsh on the African people. New found economies came up and said, this is now the new model. Have we really had an economic model that has been sustainable for the last 40 years? No. It is just interest-based. If the US wants to get something, the West wants to get something, the Chinese wants to get something, they say, this is the Exim Bank, we have money available, and all this. So let us think aloud. I conclude by saying that without ideological grounding for Africa, which is the Pan-African interest, which scholars should help us to modify, to suit the current situations, Africa will remain challenged. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Honorable Okomu. We are reminded once again that externally connected interests dating back to the Berlin Conference, all the way to contemporary neoliberal policies, and more recent strategies by China, India, South Korea, and others that will call a conference or a meeting, and all African heads of state will troop overseas to be essentially engaged on what they need to do. These need to change. And for this to change, the Right Honorable Okomu is reminding us there was a time African countries, African people were united. This was immediately at independence. The struggle for independence was a unified effort that continued all the way to the liberation of South Africa, a time when Africans spoke with one voice. And that period was also characterized by a collaboration between policymakers and academics. And if you remember, most of the nationalists at that point were also scholars in their own right. I'm thinking of people like Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and the rest of them. These were scholars. So ideas connecting policy were implemented in a way that was positive. And his question is, how do we get back there? Because we need a unified, strengthened continent in order to be able to effectively engage other states in the international system. I thank you once more. That takes me to our next presenter, discussant, Professor Luan. Think about the intersection of trade and human rights, regional integration, and share your thoughts with us on how scholarly knowledge can enhance transformative policymaking and implementation. And you can bring in some other variables as you see fit. You do work with the Africa Commission and issues of gender, climate change, and integration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. It's an honor to be here. I applaud you and thank you, USG Duarte for the invitation and for convening this. I've never thought we'll have this kind of conversation at the UN, so I'm very, very grateful to hear this. Thank you, Nididi, Maria Teresa, and others, and especially Mona, who's helped me skip the line 2 days in a row. So I can be here on time, so thank you so much. So today I want to rethink or unthink the two silos Her Excellency USG Duarte mentioned on the first day of the conference. The two silos being the existing gap between academics and policymakers who are working on Africa. So I want to interrogate these silos in terms of trade and regional integration in Africa. I want us to note with this sentence that I have for myself: policymakers are knowledge hubs. So we as scholars quite often engage in theoretical work and work in both construction and deconstruction of how, for instance, trade regimes work in Africa, how regional integration is formed in Africa. And in that deconstruction process, it seems to me one cannot start the work without going to the 1960s, to the founders of the African Union, Kwame Nkrumah, Nyerere, Haile Selassie, and others who were engaged in the conversations. And if you look and start to deconstruct or construct that conversation that happened there, for me, Haile Selassie comes as a centrist who was with this view that we should unite Africa and show the Europeans that we as Africans can actually be united. So not just as a way of integrating Africa as a political or ideological mission, but also as a way of showing the Europeans that we as Africans have our own choices and policies, and we do not operate in vacuum. So looking back at history is relevant, and I applaud Chidi during the conversation. Quite often there was this detachment between historians and legal theorists. So I encourage scholars to go beyond their own discipline and engage in multidisciplinary study of regional integration that includes law, history, economy, and society. And in my thinking, that will lead to a broader conception of regional integration as emancipation. But then also I think we should move it one step further in our thinking, because the 1960s conception of emancipation was limited to decolonization and racial equality. And I think we should move it one step further to include other forms of emancipation and movements that exist in our continent today and in the past. And that includes gender equality, minority rights. And by doing all these, we are moving away from the Eurocentric conception of regional integration that looks at integration as a functional process that starts with the economy, and then human rights is added into it. But if you look at African history, regional integration started as a political project, and economy was to be added later on. So maybe let's focus on that, if our strength is right now in the politics rather than in the economy. And this was a comment that Professor Ndulo made on the first day. The trade between Malawi and Zambia is constrained on so many levels. The comparative advantage question, the fact that the roads might not be conducive. So it's highly likely that Malawi or Zambia would trade with countries in the West, in Europe, China, or the United States, exporting mostly raw materials and importing from those countries rather than trading within Africa. So intra-African trade is quite low and is also quite often suffers from what Shanta Devarjan calls statistical tragedy. There is actually trade imbalance within the SADC region. For instance, the imports and the exports do not match in numbers, even though there is supposedly data being collected. So I think we as scholars should look at the policymakers as knowledge hub and try to theorize a policy grounded conception of regional integration. That doesn't mean that we cannot imagine and be critical, but we should start from what is on the ground or what was on the ground in Africa and build on it, rather than looking at, oh, this worked at EU and we should bring it back to Africa. And then the second point I want to make is for policymakers and governments to think as academics as allies rather than as critics and threats. So quite often when you engage with policymakers, you quite often hear, I don't understand what you're saying, or you're being critical to the government. Are you an opposition member, right? So that, I think we need to move from, I encourage all policymakers to move from beyond that conception and think as academics as allies, even if they might be writing and stating critical thoughts. So I think that thought will move also policymakers to engage with academics in a better, positive way that would allow us to move and create a better Africa. And you can look at existent academic intellectual freedom in Africa, which the Codicera has done a lot of work on and is organizing a conference in April 2025. You can see significant decline, partly because maybe, like the chair said, the early Africanists were academics themselves, maybe they had more or better views towards academics, but you see significant decline. So that relationship needs to be rebuilt, and I think more engagement, more circumstances like this that include academics and policymakers might be one of the ways we can work on it. The third and last point I would make is for scholars to engage in amplification of Africa's norm entrepreneurship. Quite often, Africa is seen as a place that is in the process of continuous borrowing of norms, as if it doesn't have its own normative framework or does not produce norms. I'm just going to bring one example of climate migrants. We hear quite often that there is a need for protection of climate migrants. And a lot of Anglophone, I don't know if French scholars are working on this, but a lot of scholars in Europe and the US are writing and seeking protection for climate migrants without looking at the African Convention on the Rights of Refugees that dates back to 1960s, that has a specific protection that protects people who have been displaced as a result of occurrences that affect public order. That was the term we used back then to refer to climate change. And then you can trace that language back to the 1980s when the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, was constructed or formed in East Africa with the aim of engaging or protecting the environmental impact of drought in the region. And people got a group protection, not an individualized protection that we see for asylum seekers or refugees in the US or Europe, but a group protection because of the climate change that affected their well-being. With that, I look forward to the next questions, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Professor Dera. I just want to emphasize two things in her presentation that complement what we already have heard. Number one has to do with the question of trade. Inter-Africa trade is less than 15%. African countries trade over 85% with outside the continent. Imagine what could happen if we increase intra-Africa trade by 50%. That will lead us closer to integration. The other idea that I find also important to highlight has to do with our tendency to forget that migration did not start with the state ineffectiveness in Africa. When Europeans came to Africa, they were migrants. They were migrants. Africans who were forcefully removed from the continent were different kinds of migrants. Migration has been part of the world. The question is, how do we deal with this internally? Because the reason Africans are dying in the Mediterranean, in the North African states, across borders is because of state ineffectiveness, our incapacity, partly induced from the outside, to make laws, enforce laws that enable our people to stay at home and work and produce to make our lives better. And don't forget the point about academic freedom, because without academic freedom, you cannot think innovatively in order to produce ideas that transform society. So I thank you once again. Thank you. Here I bring in our brother from the DRC, Dr. Toussaint, Professor Toussaint Muhala. I would like for you to share with the audience, looking at the critical dimension of the challenges that African countries face, especially from your vantage point, what are the potential solutions and intersections between state policies, education, and institutions that can promote transformative change in a way that speaks to what the first panel 2 days ago referenced as our need to reconceptualize our thinking, become more conscious. I think in your work you refer to it as heart and mind. I think it's consciousness, changing our consciousness. What are the intersections in this framework? Thank you.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Je pense que...
Thank you very much. I will speak in French. I will speak in French for ideological reasons. We are at the United Nations, and all countries should feel represented. And I'm sorry I'm going from one colonial language to another, from English to French. I should be able to speak in my mother tongue, as Professor Mugula did 2 days ago, but I have chosen French to represent that segment of the African continent, which is represented here in the question that has been asked of me is very important, but perhaps before answering, I will simply think of some preliminary thoughts and say that we are in this space as academics, as researchers, as people who are called upon to produce knowledge in trying to resolve some elements, some difficulties, problems which we find on the African continent. But I would like to recall that we do not have a monopoly of knowledge. As an educational institution or a research institution, we do not have a monopoly of knowledge. There is a reality, and there's a need for knowledge on the African continent, and I hope that all of us here will begin to pay attention to that plurality of knowledge, endogenous knowledge, and a group of scholars, of academics on the continent have taken a conscious decision to emphasize this aspect. And this will come in the second part of my statement when I will speak about African Studies, the African Studies Association of Africa, which I represent here. Before going further, I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you, because to be part of this conference is not a given. So I believe that we have to live with this awareness that that we work on the shoulders of giants, and we have to be able to look further for the future. Those who have come before us, we have spoken about our first leaders at the times of independence, who already made use of intellectual research to find lasting solutions to the problems of Africa. And I think that the first problems of Africa for those giants was the problem of sovereignty. In fact, colonization simply took away from us the possibility of having our autonomous language, a word, authentic sovereignty, sovereignty over our history, so over what we live through. And I remember our debates the first day with the Undersecretary General, with Mrs. Duarte, and the professor who spoke about memory. We have to stop begging, we have to stop blaming, was something the Undersecretary General said. And the professor responded to that by saying, no, we should stop blaming. No, we should. We have to blame the past, because it's the only way in which we can claim what has been taken from us and belongs to us. That being said, I will begin by speaking of a point of departure, a certain image of Africa. I think that Chinua, in an interview he spoke passionately about a certain image of Africa in the West. And Chinua said that the West has a representation of Africa as a space where nothing works and nothing has ever worked. And but to for humanitarian reasons, we now speak of Africa. We go to civilize Africa, but to and they say things like that to justify their inaction. And there is a certain image which we have of the African continent, and it is our duty and obligation to rebuild it. And I think that intellectual or academic research is for that, to say that the social reality in Africa today is based on morally suspect grounds, and I would say that they are erroneous. And to deconstruct that image through the quality of our research, through the moral commitment that every researcher, every intellectual on the continent should have, that is the work ahead. And in preparing this statement, I also thought about someone like MSSR. He was part of that initial group of giants on the shoulders of whom we stand. And he gave a famous speech on colonialism and said something which I have found very relevant even today. And that is what I call the point of departure. When the policymakers discuss what policy to adopt, there's always what we call this definition of the situation. What are we trying to solve? What is the issue? Now, the definition of the situation, we must criticize it, because the most common evil for us, African descendants, is that at times we work in good faith, but we don't have the right ideas. We do not present the problems rightly in order to find whatever solution. So it is up to us to be aware and to be critical and to say the social or sociological reality my colleague Kirill spoke about epistemic injustices, and other academics, other African researchers like Professor Nudimbe have spoken of a certain epistemological violence. And it's as if we knew everything and could impose it on another people, another continent. So the policymakers today include men in positions of power. I know 2 French presidents, for example, and the current, including the current President Macron and also Sarkozy, who they tried to pretend that Africa had no history, or by simply trying to recycle old verbiage of some colonialist philosophers from the 17th or 18th centuries, like Hegel, who thought that we shouldn't even ask questions about Africa. So we who take the floor in organizations like this, and the moderator, when he opened up our debate, recalled that we have this opportunity to get together, to think together, to reflect together, in order to have a future full of hope for the African continent and for our people in Africa. The second point, and I know that we will have more time for exchanges, is that I'm not speaking here in my own name. I am a delegate. I speak on behalf of the African Studies Association of Africa, and my colleagues with whom I lead the association are very happy to say at the United Nations that there is a generation made up of young African academics who want to make a difference in the continent. They work in small ways and in large ways to change the rhetoric, to change the image, and they are found in various institutions on the African continent. And I'd like to see how education and the institutions we have can contribute to changes in our ways in which to approach our social reality. And on the continent, there are many degrees that are given, but very often these people are jobless. These degrees don't lead to jobs, and they decide to emigrate. We have a generation of our giants who emigrated because the political space did not give them the possibility to freely reflect. And today, as you know, there's an immigration policy. Germany is speaking about employments in Africa as if Africa didn't have qualified people to work on the changes in Africa. So the African Studies Association of Africa tries to begin to change perspectives and content of education, and to say that what we should have for the continent is something we should do ourselves. It is leadership that we must contribute. I will end here for the moment. We will continue this conversation, and I will speak again later to present the African Studies Association and its journal. These are entities which are trying to produce knowledge in order to get to a different future for the people and continent of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Muala. You bring us back to the question of language. It is extremely important that we think for a minute about it. As was mentioned by Professor Ngugi, the keynote speaker for this conference, if you come to United Nations, only African leaders speak in colonial languages. Our laws are written in colonial languages. In fact, it goes deeper than that. 98% of the curricula that we teach across African institutions are mostly derived from overseas. They are not indigenously derived. Language is critical to community. and to collaboration. So we need to pay close attention to how our languages perhaps can contain nuggets of ideas to transform our societies. The other point I want to highlight is, because the issue has come up, Professor Hendricks mentioned it, epistemic injustice. And Toussaint has mentioned it, Professor Luan mentioned it. Some of the more critical epistemic injustices are committed by African leaders when they listen to Western scholars over and above indigenous African scholars who may have solutions for the problems that they want to solve. That's a more challenging epistemic injustice than the image that Westerners have of us. We have control of us. They don't have control of who we are. But when our leaders don't pay attention to what the scholars are saying, when they pay more attention to 2 weeks resident as experts of the DRC, that is epistemic injustice. Let's pay attention to it. Thank you so much. And the last point I want to mention has to do with the question you raised. How can our educational institutions be part of economic development? Since we are looking for solutions, we should be thinking about the locations of educational institutions across African countries. The location and the connection between these institutions and the communities in which they reside. And think about the ways, the purpose for which they were established. I'll give you just one example and we move forward. The land-grant universities in the United States were established for one purpose, funded by the government, to make sure that agricultural production, research, and innovation reaches every nook and cranny of this country. And for professors who are involved in this research to engage in extension services in those rural areas and bring back the result of implementation to the laboratory. An engagement that has resulted in this country not only being able to feed itself, but to export and have a mechanism, state mechanism, to prevent the import of goods, agricultural goods, coming from foreign countries, unless those they want to bring in. Europeans copied from the United States at the end of the Second World War and established the common agricultural policies, all aimed at protecting their societies, their farmers, being able to feed themselves. Africans, we have outsourced our food systems. That in itself is our insecurity. Thank you so much for raising the question. I just wanted to highlight that as we move on to our next presenter. This time I would like to call on our eminent ambassador in the House, Ambassador Ashraf Schwellen, to share with us his thinking on the question on how to bridge the gap between academics and policymakers, and what kind of implementation mechanism might be necessary on matters dealing with peace, security, and development across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. You're doing a great job, both as a moderator and a speaker. Thank you, Chair.
That's what they told me to do.
It's a pleasure to be. It's a pleasure to be here, and also a pleasure to be back in New York. I apologize to all of you on behalf of New York that our discussion about bridging the gap between policy and the academic world is happening in such a gloomy day, but that doesn't necessarily reflect on, or should not reflect on, the outcome of this discussion. Since this is the first time I take the floor, I want to take the opportunity to thank Her Excellency Cristina Duarte and her very capable team, especially Ndidi, who has suffered with me for the last 3 weeks or so, for inviting me to this very important and timely conference, in my opinion. I want to start with a confession. And the confession is, I sat during the deliberations of the first day and a little bit of the second day, and it was such a brutal reminder that despite that, the fact that I have actually a degree in law, that I am not a lawyer. you know, that in the company of such distinguished legal scholars and legal practitioners and professors, I cannot even try to act as if I know anything about law, especially that the law that I studied doesn't seem to matter much right now. It was more about intellectual property rights, antitrust law. But the good news is that there was a member in the family that was my wife, who was actually a specialist in human rights and constitutional law. And she went, of all universities, to SOAS. Since SOAS was mentioned yesterday and was put in such a high regard. And the problem, of course, was compounded by the fact that I am an economist by training, a diplomat by profession, and that I came from a civil law system and went, of all places, to Warwick University to get my LLM degree. So this is just a very long introduction to tell you I'm not a lawyer, and please don't treat me as one. I have actually learned a lot from listening to all of you, especially our distinguished speaker. I truly mean that. But it also made me think really hard about how can my contribution today be a meaningful one. And I am mindful, I'm actually very pleased and mindful of the presence of so many young people in the room, students, interns. So I want this to be as useful as possible. And so I will make basically two lines of argument. The first argument is that I'm going to try to fly 30,000 feet above the ground and give you the view of what I see in my office in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs every single day when I go handling African issues. This is not to say that all of the issues that were raised during the first 2 days were not important. They are incredibly important, but they are not, in my opinion, the totality of the challenges and the opportunities that face the continent. And then the second thing, as somebody who actually ran a research institution, despite being part of the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I will try to address some of the issues that were raised and introduce these two alien worlds to each other, and what I think are entry points, especially for young students and upcoming professionals within this organization and outside. So from 30,000 feet above the ground, the situation I see is a very complex one. Africa faces a lot of challenges and a lot of problems, be it on the peace and security front, on the humanitarian front, or on the development front. Conflict continues, unfortunately, in the continent. Everybody, including here, when you turn on the news and you hear the word war, you're thinking about either the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza. I don't think you hear anything about the war in Sudan. And for me, that is quite shocking, because we're basically talking about a major humanitarian crisis that displaced so far over 8 million people and threatening famine and leaving 25 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. Africa, unfortunately, is also becoming the epicenter of terrorism, in particular the Sahel region. Just to give you a very unpleasant statistic, over the past 15 years, as was quoted by the report of the Secretary General, the number of terrorist incidents and the number of deaths caused by terrorism has been increased by almost 2,860%. 2,860%. That is also the reality of Africa. There is also a growing correlation between terrorism, organized crime, drug trafficking, illegal mining, kidnappings, and the list goes on and on. And then, of course, there are the, one after the other, unconstitutional changes of government, which were mentioned before, to the point that we now have a record. I go to the meetings of the African Union, sit in a room, and we're faced with a situation of a record. 6 countries that has been suspended. Their membership has been suspended from the organization. On the development front, the challenges could not be more, are not less. They are more. as a matter of fact. Continent was doing very well until, reasonably well, until 2019, depending on the adjective you want to add. But then since 2019, which was the last time I was here in New York, and I was one of the spreaders of COVID-19, unfortunately, I guess on my flight back to Cairo, we were hit by cascading crisis, COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, which resulted in, persisting inflation, a huge debt burden, slowing down economic development, and with it, rising inflation, rising unemployment, lowering of living standards for all Africans. And hence, the result is that the Africa we want seems further away than where it should be. And if this is not complicated enough, this is always happening in the background of what can truly be described as a rising or a return of intense geopolitical struggle that actually some people have went as far as to call it a second Cold War. And so despite the similarities of the challenges and the problems that Africa faces today with the challenges that we faced 30, 40, 50 years, I think this time it's a little bit, actually I would say it's a lot more complicated and complex. And that's why what I am here to tell you today, as somebody who worked in the government, who stepped outside of government, worked in the political arena a little bit, ran a think tank, I did a few, I can say I did it all, is that what we need is nothing short of a complete paradigm shift. Madame Duarte mentioned something that I stopped at and I thought about, and it is true. We continue, and this actually doesn't only apply to African countries, unfortunately, it applies to many governments and states around the world, is that we continue to manage poverty rather than resolve it. But by the same token, by the way, we continue to manage conflict rather than resolve it. And so we need what I think should be a complete paradigm shift from managing conflict, managing hunger, managing poverty, to completely eliminating them. But that will not be achieved if we continue to use the same methods and apply the same tools. And here is where I think the rest of my presentation will focus on. I think African governments, and actually I think governments all over the world, and I think regional and international organizations need a complete reimagination. We are still coming at the problems and the challenges of the 20th century, the 21st century, with the mentality and the structures of the 20th century. And I'll give you an example. Where I sit in the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the ministry is divided into departments, right? So you have Arab countries department, Sub-Saharan African countries department, European department, American department, European department. But the challenges that we face in the world do not have such departments. If you are talking about a terrorist organization in the Sahel, they don't write cables back home. If you have a terrorist organization or an organized crime group on the border between Libya and Mali, they don't, report to various departments within the terrorist organization. They don't. They are agile, they are flexible, and hence they will continue to beat us. And hence we need to restructure our organizations. And do that in a very intentional and thoughtful way. By that I mean that all of us in the policy-making world, and I dare say in the academia as well, our solutions to problem before, and I say this to the young people in the room, was to try to simplify complexity and turn this complex world that we live in into equations of causality. This happened to this, caused this, okay? What you're going to be facing in the world as you grow up and take charge from all of us, whether academics as policymakers, is that you will need not to simplify complexity, you will need to embrace it in its totality, okay? irrespective of the type of the problem that we're talking about. Second, in order for African countries to succeed, governments need to think hard and carefully about how they allocate resources and how they use their time and where the decision makings are made. People in the room, and I felt this, I might be wrong, but people in the room, when they say government or state, they usually mean central. They don't necessarily think of regional governments. They don't necessarily think as local governments. And this, I think, we will not be able to continue with this modality, and we will need to think hard and deep about where the decision makings get done and how to allocate the resources to where the problems exist, and hence better chances of solving these problems. I will end with 2 minutes, if you allow me, Chairman. I heard our colleague on the panel talk about this. I'm switching to the point about bridging the gap between academics and policymakers. Our colleague on the panel said policymakers think of academics or researchers that come to them as critics or opposition. So let me, in the next 2 minutes, try to introduce these two words together to the extent that I can. A minute and a half. On one hand, these are people who come from very different worlds, and they operate in completely different environments. The academic has the freedom to look at the big picture and to think that if it's not all resolved, it's not resolved. The person sitting in a government agency doesn't have that luxury. He or she need to deal with bureaucracy, with budgets, with limited times and resources, and hence the ability of these two to talk to each other depends on their ability to connect and to understand the mentality of the other and where they are coming from. Second, and I have seen this, and it's a big mistake, some academics, if you accept the criticism, think that in order to make a policy impact, you need to reach to the foreign policy, to the head of the organization. And I would argue that this is a very wrong way of approaching it. Because inside organizations, there are people who are reform-minded and those who are in complete opposition to any kind of reform. And the job of the researcher that would like to make impact and not to be in an ivory tower is to search within the organization for those allies that can actually take on board your revolutionary or reform ideas. The same, by the way, applies to the level of governments I was talking about. Sometimes the solution that you're providing is not for a national level problem. Sometimes you actually might be able to provide a solution on the local level or the regional level and take it from there to the national level. Finally, I look to the young people in the room with much enthusiasm, and I would like just to add my voice to what my colleague from the DRC has just mentioned. You are in a much better position, but please, 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 because I literally cringed when I heard this said. There is no such thing as stay with the past, keep them, blamed. All the solutions are out to our problems. All of our problems, if I believe the narrative that was mentioned in this room, come from the outside, right? It's the colonial legacy, it's whatever. And it is true, and we need to be aware of it, right? Fully aware of where we come from, okay? But with an eye on the future, because in a world that will be ruled by artificial intelligence and quantum computing, you're not going to resolve that by complaining about colonial legacy. You're going to solve your problems by basically learning very well about your past and knowing where you're coming from, knowing exactly where you are today, and be aware of the world that you're about to face so that you are prepared for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Swalen. I will not spend much time pinpointing the key issues. They are familiar to you, but I just want to join him in urging the young people to embrace complexity. The question becomes what we mean by that. And the other thing, because it connects with our next presenter, is the idea of reimagination. It is Mark Twain who says, you cannot see with your eyes if your imagination is out of focus. As Africans, we need to refocus our imagination to look at how we solve our domestic problems across regions, across the different states, etc. And this is where we come to our last presenter. We put him last for a specific reason. He just published a book on re-envisioning the African and American academies. And he does have a way of actually implementing policies. So I won't go into detail about the things he has done. If you want to know more about Paul Salazar, Professor Paul Salazar, as they say, he's very Googleable. So, Prof, over to you. Just share with us some nuggets from your book that policymakers and academics can take in order to re-envision, reimagine, and, if you will, solve some wicked problems in the continent. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And coming last means that everything has already been said, so I could just shut up. But I don't think I was brought here to keep quiet, and he has prompted me to talk about my book. And every academic cannot resist talking about their publications. Yeah, right. So I want to start, I'll just make 5 points. The first point is to stress the importance for us to take intellectual history, the history of ideas, and the history of knowledge-producing institutions seriously. We sometimes, in much of our discourses, they're very anecdotal, and we don't seem to place a lot of value on actually systematically studying what's going on with regards to our knowledge-producing institutions, including, of course, universities. The second point with regards to that point is the sheer diversity of Africa's intellectual libraries, to use the terminology by the great Congolese philosopher Mudimbe. They are more than the colonial library in Africa's intellectual libraries. And then it's also important for us, I think, to understand that the global ecology of knowledge production is extremely diverse and complex. We tend to be focused on the Europhone library, what the Europeans and the Americans are saying and thinking, without paying much attention to what's going on in Asia and other parts of the world. So the second point I want to share with you is, of course, the summary of the book, which is this text. It was published 3 weeks ago by Codesria. In fact, we launched it last Friday in Dakar. I will not bore you, obviously, with the details of the book, hoping that you're going to buy it. But what I'll do is simply indicate the scope of issues that I'm trying to deal with in the book without any elaboration, except if you ask me questions later on. So it's divided into 8 chapters. And it was prompted by my engagement with both African educational systems as well as the American educational system. I've been in the United States at about 6 or 7 universities for the last 25 years or so. And I've been at a number of African universities, including Kenya, where I was vice chancellor at one of the universities in Nairobi. So I'm familiar with both systems. And I wanted to put both systems into comparison with each other. And what you discover when you do that is that, of course, there are differences, but there are also a lot of interesting similarities. And some of the challenges affecting African universities are similar challenges even if their iteration might be different to the challenges facing American universities. So the book opens with a chapter titled "The Struggle for African Universities and Knowledges," and it looks at institutional explosion, epistemic, the debates, the issues of challenges facing these universities, and so on and so forth. And it ends in chapter 8 with what I call America's troubles with affirmative action. We are all familiar with the issues about affirmative action in this country. And then the 6 chapters in between provide a comparative analysis on a number of areas that affect universities, whether in Africa or the United States. And this second chapter is on higher education and development. How is higher education conceived as an engine of economic transformation, of development in the two geographies, the United States and Africa? And here I look at issues to do with how did African leaders, I spent a lot of time looking at the thought of some of the founder presidents in Africa, Kwame Nkrumah, Nyerere, and so on, and the first leaders of African universities. How did they imagine the African university? And then what happened with regards to its role in development, the whole question about human capital, the issues about technology, science, technology, and innovation, and so on, and the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. How are they playing out in the two geographies across the Atlantic? And the third chapter looks at managing and financing universities. As I indicated, I was a vice chancellor in Nairobi, but I've also been involved in academic leadership at many American universities as center director, college dean, academic vice president, and so on. So I'm familiar with the kinds of issues that American higher education leaders have to face. So how do they try to manage their institutions from a governance point of view, but also the whole question which keeps most presidents awake at night: how do they finance the institutions? And I look at, not only what's happening in the two places, but also the trends in global financing of higher education, in Asia, in Europe, in the Americas, of course, including the US, and seeing where Africa fits. And then the fourth chapter is an experience we all went through, navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. How prepared was the world, particularly the higher education world, in navigating this? I used to be a member of the board of the Association of International Universities, and we commissioned a number of studies. In fact, one study just before COVID on looking at the technological capacities of universities around the world. It came out in October 2019, and 3 months later, COVID, of course, was discovered in Wuhan and spread in the following year around the world. And what happened in terms of responses by institutions in Africa, in the United States, and other parts of the world to COVID. And also, very important, how did the lessons of COVID influence the ways in which these institutions have tried to deal with the post-COVID situation? In many cases, there are 3 tendencies. One is many universities have been in a hurry to try to return to the past, pre-COVID. In other words, a reform agenda. And others, a restoration agenda. And others argue that the impact of COVID on their core functions of teaching and learning, research and scholarship, public engagement and service, as well as, of course, internal operations, is such that, there is need to graft some of the lessons from that experience into changes in the ways in which their institutions are organized and the way they are administered. And this leads to a reform agenda. And others believe that the crisis was so deep that we need to rethink the entire system. And they're trying to urge, for a transformation agenda. And then the next chapter, 5th chapter, looks at the whole question of how do we envision education over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Time is almost up. And then also I look at the whole question of lifelong learning. What's going on in the landscape of lifelong learning? And then finally, how do we reposition the humanities and social sciences, which are being disparaged everywhere? Let me just share with you, a few data points with regards to the African higher education landscape. So in terms of enrollment, there's been a massive explosion. There were 6.2 million students in tertiary institutions in 2000. By 2020, there were 26.1 million. This was still a very small proportion of the world's students. In 2000, there were 100.1 million tertiary students globally, and then in 2020, 236.1 million. And then when it comes to Africa's gender parity, it is still behind the world. We have not reached gender parity in other world regions that has been done. When you look at research, our expenditures on research are pretty sobering. African countries, on average, spend 0.59% of their, of their GDP on research and development, R&D. The world average is 1.79%. And then when it comes to researchers per million, the global average is 1,368. For Africa, it's 326.4. So we are lagging in that area. Publications is quite, again, quite sobering. We produce 3.5% of global scholarship, a little less than Canada. That's the entire continent. Should be sobering. And Asia is producing more than 40% of global scholarship. It's the highest in the world. And then when it comes to patents, we account for 0.5% of global patent applications. For Asia, it's 66.6%. Patent grants, 0.4%. For Asia, is 58.1%. Trademarks and registrations for Africa is 1.88%. For Asia, 69.3%. Let me just conclude by pointing to sort of how we can look at African universities. They have gone through 3 periods, according to my analysis. One is what I call the nationalist university. Second is the developmental university. And third, which has been with us since the 1990s, is what I call the neoliberal university. I would like to close by, as a former dean of a college of liberal arts, to say that the devaluation that we are witnessing in the world today of the humanities and social sciences is terribly unfortunate. The humanities and social sciences are extremely important for many reasons, 4 of which stand out in my mind. One, they have intrinsic value. The sheer joy of learning, of asking the big questions, is something that we should value. And of course, they have instrumental value in terms of providing the kinds of skills and competencies that are useful for the world of work. And they have intellectual value in terms of imparting to students intercultural skills, international skills, interdisciplinary skills, information skills, and so on and so forth. And finally, they have what I call idealistic value in the cultivation of moral imagination of students, as well as, of course, cultivation of civic values. And for these reasons, and precisely because of technology, as the previous speaker indicated, technology is taking over a lot of jobs. Previously we thought that it was only people in manufacturing who were in trouble. Now it's also intellectual workers or people who are involved in the world of work, of intellectual, cognitive activities. A lot of that is going to be taken over by AI. It's already doing that. Now, the question is, how do we maintain the relevance of humans as not only economic actors, but also as social beings? And one can argue that critical thinking and creativity will become even more important than they have ever been in human history. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Seleza. You all got the idea from his book, And the most challenging thing we have to deal with is what we do within our institutions and the connections between those and policy making. As we saw, for example, in more recent times, the financial crisis in 2008, the COVID-19, and the war in Ukraine all have direct impact on African countries, African institutions, because we haven't built in the resilience to withstand those external shocks. We can do so through our educational institutions, working collaboratively as allies, not as oppositional entities. Because of time, I'm going to allow for just a few seconds of questions or comments that you may have with each other. I'm talking to the panelists. We don't have a lot of time left, so 1 minute each. If you have a question for one of your colleagues, or if you have a final comment that you must make, you don't have to. Let me start from the last speaker and go down this way. Yes, Paul?
I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions, but obviously time doesn't allow. I'm just curious how my colleagues see the role of universities as engines of socio-economic transformation in Africa.
Thank you. Luan?
So this is a question to Paul. Do you have a breakdown of the regions within Africa, how the data you have aggregated on the enrollment, which sounds to have gone skyrocketed? If you could share that breakdown at one point, would be interesting to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kumu?
Mine is just a comment that given the situations Africa is in, we shouldn't accept to become the normal. If we do accept to become the normal, then in the near future with globalization, artificial intelligence, we shall become the current normal of the indigenous people in Canada and Australia, if we are not careful.
Thank you very much. Cheryl?
Mine is, I guess, to Ashraf, and it's following on this idea of needing to reimagine, restructure our peace and security institutions. So we have a new agenda for peace, we've got a pact for the future, etc. But it's still a tinkering around with the instruments. Is there the appetite to go the distance that we need to go in order to produce new organizations? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Toussaint?
Je vais rester consistant.
I'll be consistent and keep speaking in French. Now, I also wanted to turn to the ambassador, who reminded us precisely that when it comes to decision-making, it's necessary for academics to be able to identify in decision-making those that think like them, that are like-minded, with whom they can work, make a coalition. Now, in response to the question, I'm wondering whether these types of meetings, this type of contact, this type of policy making can be done on an African level between African people without any type of external mediation, even from an institution like the United Nations. That's what I'm wondering. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Ambassador, do you have a question or a brief comment? 15 seconds, like your...
So if it is 15 seconds, the answer to your question is yes.
Thank you so much, panelists. We do have discussants, and Mr. Master of Ceremony, I hope you give them not more than 6 minutes each, because we want to hear from the audience. Could you please introduce the discussants? Thank you.
Professor Kelechi Kalu Ndalo, thank you very much. We have two discussants. They are probably going to give you some minutes back because you've been such a gracious professional moderator. We have, first of all, the Chief of the Education Outreach Section here at the Department of Global Communications, Ms. Jayashree Wyatt. Please, you have a couple of minutes.
Thank you so much, Ben. Hopefully my microphone is going to be turned on soon.
They are working on it.
Okay, there we go. I just want to say, wow, what a rich conversation. I'm so appreciative of all of the different viewpoints. I've taken so many notes. There isn't time for me to sort of feed back on all of my impressions, but let me just say a couple of key things. In my role, I oversee the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative. It's known as UNAI. It's a network of over 1,700 universities in over 150 countries. The other piece in my portfolio that is relevant to today's discussion is a mandated program by the United Nations member states, and it is the outreach program on the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. So I just really want to feed back to you that I think the points that you made about understanding the context, Professor Kalu, about, how did the conditions that we're currently facing, how did they come about? We must understand the past. We live in a context right now where we see so much mis and disinformation. We see narratives, right, that are being subverted. We see denial, we see distortion, we see marginalization. This is the context that academics are also operating within. So a couple of the other points that I just wanted to make. How can we serve you? After hearing all this incredible work, how can we serve the aims that you have as academics? One of the things that I just want to raise up is that we have a set of SDG Hub chairs. There's 17 of them. They are each led by a university. Currently, 2 of those chair hubs are led by universities in Africa. We make it a strategic priority to uplift and spotlight African scholarship by African scholars in all of the work that we do. So I would love to work with each and every one of you on strengthening that strategic outreach that we do here at the UN. And we can also continue to work with you, I think, on the transatlantic slave trade and slavery program as well. I think my main point today to everyone here in the audience, I'm so pleased to see so many young people in the audience as well, is we're also working to highlight and bring forward burgeoning scholars. We think that that is absolutely critical, supporting them, scaffolding them, and giving them opportunities to voice the research that they are working on as well. So we really look forward to working with you on that. We are your allies. We are part of the infrastructure here at the United Nations. We recognize also the African Union's theme for this year around reparations and justice for Africans and people of African descent, and we want to work with you on that as well. I also recognize that academia was mentioned specifically in the Pact of the Future. And so we also need to lean into these other intergovernmental processes in the United Nations system to be able to bring forth academia. What we see in our work is the over-representation of global scholars from the North. So we're in this work with you to create balance on that front. So I think those are the main comments that I have to you, and I thank you ever so much because all of the scholarship that you have shared with us today will inform the work that we do and the way that we develop our strategic priorities. So I thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ms. Jayashree Wyatt. From the UN Academic Impact, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as you can see within the hall, there is some action going on because we want to take the views, the questions, comments, and recommendations of everybody here. So before we go to the last discussant, and for those who are online on YouTube, either in French or English, please post your questions and your viewpoints there, and we are going to take action on them. We will try and squeeze in as much as possible before we hand over to Undersecretary General Christina Duarte in about 40 minutes. So now, let's go to the last but not the least discussant, Ms. Christina McIlwainey. She is the Chief Operations Officer of the UN University Center for Policy Research. The floor is yours, your hand up, and then we will get the microphone working. Thank you.
Wonderful, that worked very smoothly, thank you. It's a really great personal honor and privilege to join you on this final day of this very important academic conference. I'm here, as was mentioned, representing United Nations University, and I bring greetings from our UNU rector and USG, Shalid Zimarwala. I think quite a number of you know him. He's, I think, a personal embodiment of bringing together policy and academia, because he's a former Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg and is now an Undersecretary General and part of the UN system and UN family, part of the Secretary General's Chief Executives Board, a member of the Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board. So he's a very strong voice within the system for bringing the voice of academia into the UN policy space, and also for bringing an African voice into the UN policy space. I'd really like to echo the comments of my co-discussant to warmly thank the panelists. I think your contributions were so thought-provoking. You set out the complex challenges that we clearly have. You also set out opportunities and ideas. And I think very importantly, you set out the historical context, because we don't work in a vacuum. I think every one of you brought a different but related historical context to the discussions that we're having today. So thank you for those. I think they were very enriching. I have a long set of remarks about the work that UNU does, but I'm putting that to one side in the interest of hearing from other voices. But I just want to mention a couple of things, if you'll indulge me. One is that UNU's mission really resonates, I think, with a lot of what you've said here today, because our mission is to address global critical issues pertaining to human survival, development, and welfare through collaborative research and education. We function as a global think tank. We also offer some postgraduate educational opportunities. We deliver policy-relevant research and capacity building. Professor Hendricks, you spoke about the need to have and engage researchers from Africa, to have African scholars feed into policymakers. And we see UNU playing a very important role in that very important task. We take some practical steps. You know, we have one institute, we have a small number of institutes around the world. We have one in Ghana, working on natural resources in Africa. But beyond that, we have other institutes in different parts of the world with a focus on Africa, some offering educational opportunities. I'd mention one. Our institute in Dresden offers an innovative doctoral program for Global South students, and one that we're very proud of. So as I said, a key goal for UNU is to serve as a bridge between the Global South and Global North. And I'm really committing here today to continue in that effort, led by our, I would say, very dynamic Undersecretary General, who's very personally committed to these ideas as well, to bring research from Africa into the UN system and into the global discourse. We commit to fostering connections. And I think the final word I'll say is, you know, today is an opportunity to develop those connections. I mean, the quality of conversation that we've had and the backgrounds of all of those who are involved today, I think together we can collaborate and work to address the many challenges that were so eloquently spoken about today. So thank you very much.
We thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Christina McIlwainey of the UN University Center for Policy Research. Ladies and gentlemen, I am handing you back in a short moment to Professor Kelechi Kalu, but I want to mention a few people who are online, on YouTube, offering some questions and offering some points. Jonelle Ferguson, you mentioned reparations, and you are asking what is the best way to join the fight for Africa's transformation. I guess you start where you are. We have questions from Andrew Ojulong. You want to add that Africa has the potential to thrive in the global knowledge economy. We must continue to address inequalities. Going on, Benny Watson, solutions grounded without an understanding of the past are doomed to fail. That is the point from Benny Watson. Embracing complexity requires an understanding of past failures to avoid future repeats. Hashtag colonial legacy matters. Matilda Moyo, we saw you there online. Andrew Ojulong, we must continue to address inequalities within Africa, invest in education, research and innovation, and advocate for equitable access to basic social services, including support for public libraries. And then I think I could take one last one here, but to save time, Professor Kalu, you have 40 minutes for the entire world over here in Conference Room 2 and also online on YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to do things slightly different today. I will take the first 5 people and then give the panelists the opportunity to respond, and they will have 1.5 minutes for their questions. And then I'll go to the bottom and take the next 5, then come to the middle and take 5. So 3 rounds. If we have time, I'll take the rest of the people that are here. So I don't know who you are. I'm not intentionally not calling you, but we are glad you're here. Thank you so much. 403. Raise your hand so you can be.
Okay, thank you so much. Wonderful discussion as always. I'm Tinashe. I'm at NYU and on the job market. So my first question is to the ambassador. I wanted to ask this characterization, if I heard it correctly, of government officials uniquely facing bureaucratic and budgetary pressure, which is something I think academics will say they also face in their own setting. Is it not possible that these pressures are actually shared, and thinking of them as, even though one probably has got pressures from electoral pressure, another maybe is trying to secure tenure, but surely they all face these same sort of budgetary and bureaucratic pressures, and if we think of them as sharing those, does it not make it easier for them to connect, as you said? And then for the rest of the panel, I think my question is really about human rights. Given the individualistic nature of most rights and adversarial nature, versus the conciliatory and perhaps communitarian understandings within Africa, has there really ever been any society that has been transformed based on, let's say, rights enforcement versus dealing with the actual underlying power structures that produce the inequality that we hope the framework of rights will be able to address? I'm thinking there about the reality of rights creep. We know that the number of rights post-World War II has doubled across the world. If you look at the countries with the most rights in the world, the top 10, Africa is ably represented. Cape Verde has 87 of them, Angola 80, but it never really seems to produce the results that we're looking for. Should we not focus more on the power relations? I'm reminded here of the speech by Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o, very evocative when he's speaking in his native language, but certainly I think we must confess that is very powerful symbolically, but unless we give our local languages economic value, right, like a currency, if the country does not require that a local currency is used, then it is not likely that people would ever use it. And similarly with our languages, is not the question, how do we give them economic value for people to want to speak in local languages, as opposed to making it a framework of rights and enforcement in which we constitutionalize the rights, perhaps we have symbolic speeches, but people are never going to actually want to participate in those languages unless, as they did in Quebec, to pass a French language act where you require everyone to use the language.
Thank you. Please, on behalf of Professor as his spokesperson, we beg you, keep it short, direct, and impactful. We beg you, time is against us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Without doing that, I'll have them cut you off. Ask your question directly, please. 338. Raise your hand, sir. Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much. First, congratulations to the excellent panel, continuing the tradition that we began on Tuesday, I'm just kidding, of excellence. Just very quickly, I just have 3 quick thoughts. The first is to set a research agenda, first for the indefatigable USG and academics present and others here. We need to know more about the conditions, under what conditions knowledge and ideas have received optimal take-up in the past, right? So we need to know that precisely. So unless we know that, we are not going to be able to scale it up and expand it. So we need to know. I think Ambassador Swellam has, talked about disaggregation, right? So don't take organizations as monoliths, like minds, things like that. So we need to know more and disseminate it so we know here are the conditions under which knowledge take-up is optimized, right? So, and then how we can then scale up and disseminate strategies to do that. Then secondly, we need more scholar practitioners, meaning people who at the same time are scholars and practitioners. And the point about Azikiwe and co, the first generation, is so important. Azikiwe was a professor in the US, right? Here at Lincoln University. And Nkrumah, these were scholars. These were not just practitioners or nationalist leaders. We have a significant deficit of that right now. So once you have that, neither the scholarship side or the practice side is going to suffer, right? So we're going to have people who understand the importance of both at the same time. Praxis. I don't want to start talking Marxism at the UN, but praxis is a language, old language, right? We need more of that. And then we need to intensify or create conditions for intensification of contact. And we need to multiply spaces where such close engagement can happen. So congratulations to the USG. This is a good first step, but we need to multiply those spaces and scale it up radically, right? So that, because my experience at the UN, Human Rights Council, is that the diplomats were thirsty for academic input. That is my experience, right? I didn't see any hostility. So we need to do that, and with that, I will just, before Professor Kelechi cuts me off.
Thank you so much, Professor Kafo, for your input. 380, please raise your hand. 380.
Good afternoon. My name is Ambassador Sheku Foyo. I run a youth and child organizations in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Moving forward, a lot of brilliant ideas have come up today in these sessions, and I want to thank Ambassador Ashraf for recognizing the participation of young people here today. Moving forward, I think we're here to discuss and participate. A lot of young people have gathered so many informations. How can we use these informations to ensure we use them in our different institutions and empower our colleagues who are not fortunate to be here? Can we have a specific platform together and then share experience, knowledge of expertise, and then connect with young people across the globe? Thank you very much.
Thank you for that excellent question.
I love that. Thank you.
Number 351, please raise your hand. 351, yeah.
Hello, my name is Jane Kani Edward. I'm Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Fordham University. This is my second time attending this conference. I attended the one of last year. And my question is, what is next after this conference? Today is the last day of the conference. What is next? and how can the UN Office of a Special Advisor on Africa help us connect it so that we'll be able to collaborate between those who are here and those who are in Africa. My second question is, yes, on Monday and then today, the idea of curriculum in Africa, that the curriculum doesn't reflect the realities of the African people and the African continent. So in what ways can African academics, both in Africa and in the diaspora, particularly in the US, collaborate to transform the curriculums of African schools, colleges, and universities to reflect the norms and realities of the African societies and cultures? And my last question is linked to the first one. What are the best ways of collaborations between diaspora and Africa? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And the last, for this round of questions, the last person, 445. 445. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Mustafa. I am a master's student at Columbia University here in New York. The Democratic Republic of Congo holds some of the most prestigious resources in the world, particularly when it comes to global industries like electronic and renewable energy. Most often, these resources have been exploited by foreign corporations under weak governance systems. Communities where these resources have been exploited are left in poverty. How can African scholarship reshape the governance landscape in a way that benefit local communities where these resources are exploited, and also empower stakeholders in those resources, in those communities? In addition to that, okay, thanks. In addition to that, recently we have observed a surge in coups across Africa, mostly because of bad governance systems, corruption, economic hardship. How can African scholarship reshape this, dynamics into creating a political resilience structure to stop the growing coups across Africa?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please help us to help you, help Professor Kalu to help you. Keep it short. We are pleading with you, we are begging with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Panelists, you've had 5 different comments and questions. Quite a few were pointed at you, Ambassador Swallen, so why don't I give you the first shot? Please don't take more than 2 minutes.
I love the question about what's next, because that's the way my brain functions. So, okay, we're here. We attended this meeting. We had these discussions. There are 2 ways, and I'll treat here carefully in the presence of the Undersecretary General, so maybe a couple of ideas. The next conference takes place under a new theme that is, the topic of the date. It gets a lot of attention, so on and so forth. That's the easy way of doing things. The more complicated and way more demanding way of doing things is basically focusing on our attention on a couple, no more, couple of the issues that we think are central to the discussion, have them define a stream of work. It doesn't need to be conferences. It can be research papers. It can be all sorts of collaborations, and I can see natural alliances here just in the front row. We have the Office of the Undersecretary General, UN you, who I am very familiar with their work, and I think impressive high-quality work, UNI, which I'm being introduced to, and involving these younger generation people who are in the room, so that when we come to the next conference, we have actually acted on some of the ideas that were generated here. So that would be my recommendation. Just to address the issue about this gap and take a minute more to talk about it. As somebody who sits in a government office, when I have an academic coming to me, it's very easy for me, and sometimes I'll be completely honest, convenient to just shut the door completely, because I have so much on my plate. I can't take your crazy visionary ideas. I have no interest of doing that. So what I will suggest to you is the following. There are, I don't want to quote Rumsfeld, but I will quote him for. So number one, there are the problems that we know, right? The governments, there are certain problems, be it developmental, peace and security, or whatever, that they're working on day in and day out. In the health sector, in the education, so on and so forth. These are very easy because they are already within the system. And the points that I mentioned about your entry points and where you make the entrance and at what level, central, local, national, become handy. The second ones are the ones, the more difficult ones, where you're basically, remember when Rumsfeld used to know the unknown unknowns? When you're actually trying to bring to the attention of the government something that you think the government doesn't know about. That is way more challenging because it's to get and less allies within the organization. So that is more difficult. The third and the most difficult one is to bring to the attention of the government organization in particular the idea that they need to reform themselves. Good luck with that.
Thank you. Thank you for being as brief as you were. Susan, do you have?
Okay, very quickly, maybe I will begin with a question on the DRC because I come from, oh, sorry, I'm speaking in French. I'm supposed to be speaking. Anyway, alors, ce que je voulais, I will just go in English, okay? Very good. So the question about the DRC and the resources is a very critical question. I think Professor Chidi mentioned that also when he spoke. It didn't begin today. It is not going to end today. However, responding to the question that you raised, I want to say that the African Studies Association of Africa, in fact, decided intentionally to hold its biennial conference in 2023 in the DRC and in Lubumbashi, which is one of the areas where you have these minerals. And from Lubumbashi, the African Studies Association agreed to start an academic journal, which is called Bokutani, meaning encounters. They went all the way to where Lumumba was assassinated in 1961. To just make that kind of pilgrimage, intellectual pilgrimage, just to say when we come together as scholars and researchers, maybe we can reach that critical mass of the lobbying that we want to take this information where they belong. But also very quickly, I can say that information about what has been going on in the Congo from the past to today, this is not lacking. There are so many reports that have been produced by the UN experts, which come to the UN and sometimes disappears in the corridors of the UN because of political motivations and actors who have vested interest in displacing populations to just have access and grab those resources. So that's what I can say, but also to finish with the last question, I would say that, the intention of creating the African Studies Association of Africa was for our elders, our brothers, to say we need to take also these conversations back on the African continent and bring scholars together. So usually we have 200, 300, 600 scholars coming to discuss in different settings, different countries, Nairobi, Cape Town. We are going next year to Cabo Verde to discuss some of the African responses to all the global challenges that we are facing on a daily basis and try to influence the reality. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Hendricks, please, briefly.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our two discussants, and do pass my regards to Prof. Chirwala. I worked at the university when he was there. But I think there's a set of questions around the unequal relations in knowledge production and how we overcome those, and it's through connections and partnerships and feeding into each other. And I think those are all very important. But we also have to examine the kinds of partnerships that are happening and why we're seeing, Paul, such a low production of knowledge as well, because in those partnerships, they're actually pretty unequal, where we are relegated to being data collectors and the theorization and analysis is happening elsewhere. So we need more investment in our research on our continent. There's inequality within our countries, between our universities, between our different countries, and between the continents, and that is partly what we need to address too. Then I think we have broken down some of the barriers between policy making and research. Some of us call ourselves pracademics because, because we do move between these spaces, and within the peace and security space in particular, we've gone pretty far in sort of walking the walk with people at the AU and in the RECs, etc. And we've now just established Net for Peace, where researchers, think tanks, etc., come together with our policymakers, and they too have been academics. It's not this complete divide, so they understand where this is coming from. But importantly, we decide on the research agenda together. It's not the researchers going out there and coming with their research. This is the problem that we are facing, and then we go out, do the research, come back. And that's
Can you say a couple of words about Network for Peace?
So Net for Peace was established by the African Union Department of Politics, Peace and Security, basically trying to get knowledge production to feed into policy processes. But there are others. So for governance and human rights, etc., there's the AGA platform, the African Governance Architecture. There's the Tana Forum, there's ASWAN. There are a number of these high-level dialogues that I think are out there that we need to utilize a bit more as well.
Thank you. Do you have any contribution? There was no specific question to you, Honorable Hokomo. Do you have quick comment?
I just want to make a comment on two brief things. One is about coups in Africa. First, why are these coups popular? When challenge.
I think somebody's trying to do a with your microphone. So use the one for Professor. He's
Absolutely. So what I'm trying to say is that some of these coups come out of a background of undemocratic tendencies, election rigging, violation of human rights. But the response to this coup, how the world institutions and world government respond to these coups, sometimes they complicate the situations, because some of them respond by sanctions and all this. I think if coups take place, let us do some assessment, find out the reasons behind some of these coups, engage the coup leaders, and try to sober them down. Secondly, about natural resources, is something we must look at, that natural resource conflict is a reality in Africa. Unless we address it, it's just not going to be in DR Congo. There are shared natural resources across Africa. There are oil wells being shared between countries. There are water basins being shared. And unless we confront this with scholarly approach, we are going to fight among ourselves in Africa over natural resources.
very important intervention that we need to take into account. Professor Dera?
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I want to engage with the online questions and comments that were raised.
Very briefly.
Yes. So I'm just going to summarize it, but one of the thoughts that came into my mind when I heard the input from the online participants was that reparations for Africans, would that lead to transformation, and how does Africa get a better deal in terms of trade or foreign direct investment? So I want all of us to think about whether markets could be a source of solution for racial discrimination. The Durban Declaration has specific list, and one of the two things that are on the list are FDI and better trade deals. So one way to think about reparations, if we are going to include market in that conversation, is maybe to think about like Botswana, how Botswana was able to renegotiate its investment treaties that was raised in the first day. Maybe these are the kind of conversations we can have in line with the reparation dialogue we ought to have globally. Thank you.
Thank you. There were questions that touch on ideas of education. So,
just 3 comments. You asked about the breakdown of the data. I'm always worried when I see people talk about Africa when they're actually talking about one country and sometimes one village. So I'm always mindful that if I'm going to talk about Africa, it has to be Africa-wide data. So in the book, much of the data is really continental. In cases where there is no continental data or where I need to make qualitative arguments, I look at countries across the continent in all 5 regions: North Africa, West Africa, East, Central, and Southern. So in each chapter, you'll find that I have specific case studies on each particular region, looking at specific countries, both the big ones, your Egypts, but also your Mauritius type in terms of size and so on. The second point I want to make is with regards to data, and I would like to appeal, since we are at the UN, please, 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 get the international organizations to stop producing data on sub-Saharan Africa and then MENA region. Africa is Africa. What I had to do in my book, I would get the data on sub-Saharan, then I would spend a lot of time unpacking the data from the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, and look at the 5 North African countries to incorporate into my African data. It will be easier, like the African Development Bank does, to produce continent-wide data. If you want to have regions, use the AU regions, which is the 5 on the continent and the diaspora. The second point I want to make is with regards to collaboration that you raised between the diaspora and the continent, whether it's in research or curriculum development. I think there have to be some fundamental principles that we follow if it is going to be successful. One is obviously co-creation. Don't go there and say you know better. They'll just laugh at you. In fact, they will ignore you. Respect, humility, and mutuality of benefits. Several years ago, we created a program called the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Program, which was based on research I did on African academics in Canada and the United States and how they engage Africa. And we put these principles into that. It still has some challenges, but we made sure that basic principles of mutuality, of co-creation are honored. Finally, the question of what's next. I'm always struck by, let me share with you an anecdote. PLO Lumumba, I was at a conference with him in Addis Ababa a few weeks ago. And he said that we should stop having all these conferences because they don't lead to anything. And really just, we have a lot of ideas already on the shelves. Let's implement. But the point I want to make in that context is that I have attended 4 conferences within the last 6 weeks, and they're all the same. One was the UNESCO one, and the AU in Addis Ababa. It was on knowledge production in Africa. The other one was in Sharjah by the Africa Institute. It was on knowledge production in Africa. And then last week in Codesria, knowledge production in Africa, and this one. And there don't seem to be coordination, synergies between those. At one level, it's good, because it means a lot of people are talking about these issues. But on another level, the lack of interaction seems to be quite striking, in my view. And it leads to the phenomenon that Lumumba was complaining about, that we love talking and don't do much.
Thank you very much. For the interest of the student here who may not know, the reason international institutions produce data that is sub-Saharan Africa but say to represent Africa has to do with the person, or excuse me, the country that established or helped establish those institutions, the United States. From United States perspective, Africa is sub-Saharan Africa, because North Africa, in fact, if you look at the nomenclature and the structure of the State Department, North Africa is part of the Middle Eastern region. It's Middle Eastern region. So you see the racial bifurcation. In fact, North Africa is referred to as Caucasian Africa within that structure. That's why you see the data, Africa is black, if you will. It has nothing, for them the skin pigmentation is the dividing line. Go and look it up if I'm making it up. Thank you so much. Next set of questions, and please don't make too much we don't want statement questions. I'll call on number 350.
Thank you very much. My name is Melon Ngube. I am from South Africa, and I'm an African young women's leader under the UNDP and the African Union. My question today is very simple. Our moderator opened with a very, very striking and powerful quote from Karl Marx, which brings me to speak about the limitation to agency due to our fragmented policies. And thank God today we have someone from the IJR on the panel. So I want us to speak on the injustices, the colonial injustices that fragment our political platform, especially in South Africa. I want to speak of a young girl from Vosloorus, a township that was marginalized due to the apartheid spatial fragmentation and the social injustices that come with that. A young girl from Vosloorus is still far away from economic opportunities, has no future prospects or an access to quality decolonized education. How do our policies speak to that? How has our policies adapted to that? Do we continue going forward with creating an Africa that is fit for the 21st century? Or do we go back to the basics and say, how do we incorporate these children? How do we incorporate these females, these women that were left behind and are still spatially fragmented in the society? And I'll just double barrel that question.
Please
and also speak
brief.
on universities. 30 seconds, allow me to land, please. 30 seconds. I want to speak on the role of universities in Africa. Just not so long ago, in 2016, we were fighting for free decolonized education in South Africa during the FISMA's fall. We were tear-gassed, we were tortured, we were ambushed because of that. Today, my peers are still sitting around. A Tuesday looks like a Saturday in Vosloorus. The youth is in the streets. They are not working. They don't have the fees or the means to access quality education or universities. We are sitting here discussing policies. We are sitting here discussing a way forward. But there's a big, big, big youth that is left behind, 10 years behind, if we may. So how are we addressing that in our policies, and how are we ensuring that everyone has access to education despite of being segregated by apartheid or the means that they may have? Siyabonga. Thank you.
Thank you.
I welcome the passion, but it means then I have to shorten the number of questions. So I'll go to number 379.
Yes, Queen Mother. Yes, Queen Mother, in the spirit of our ancestors, I'm so proud to hear from the young people today, hear their voices, because they are the one leading the way for sustainable development. I'm very pleased that on the agenda in many of the rooms here this week, the word is reparations. Reparation means economics. And that economics need to be discovered. As Queen Mother had said to the United Nations, she will accept a down payment of $3 trillion. So today we have called on our President of the United States of America, which is 55 million of us, cut the check in the spirit of our elder Queen Mother Moore. And when you spoke of education, just one more minute, that is, we must, young people, sit at the knee of great scholars that have come this way. Julius Nyerere, Kiswahili is East and West as a language, but as a scholar, a teacher, a master teacher. It is imperative that we would say, isn't the best thing for us to do allow them to sit at the knee of scholars that have gone before us?
Okay.
Imperative. I thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the last question, because we have to have time for the Undersecretary, Christina Duarte, to give us a closing statement. The last question for the panelists to respond to will come from number 354, excuse me. 354. No? Okay, I'll go to number...
It's right here. No, 354 is my number. It cannot be 2. No, you can give it to the young. I'm 354 here, okay. But I'm 354. But if you want the young person to have it, I've been in academia for... Okay.
Yes, your mic is on.
Okay. Yes, I've been in academia for about 35 years, a distinguished Carnegie Fellow when Carnegie was created at the University of Ghana. I'm a Fulbright National Fellow. I'm also a Boring National Fellow. And going back to Africa, back and forth, I found out that the African self and the European American other still remains. What can we do to decolonize academia in Africa? Thank you.
That's a subject about curriculum. Yes. I think you want to take the lady and then...
414, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Habiba. I am a master's student at the New School. So you mentioned about indigenous languages in teaching in schools, and it brought to mind for me indigenous knowledge and the current tug of war that is happening between scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge. I wondered if you foresee a future in which indigenous knowledge takes the center, well, not the center, but takes a validation that it requires, because as Africans, we all know that the remedies and the treatments that our grandmothers prescribe do work. But this sort of knowledge is not validated. And if you do see a future where that becomes validated, what are some steps or actions that we can take to contribute to that becoming a reality? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to the panelists, I'm only giving opportunity to 2 people to respond to the questions. So first, I'll go to Professor Hendricks, because there's a question directly dealing with South Africa, and then I want to go to Professor Seleza, because 2 questions dealing with education.
Just very quickly on validation. We must validate. We must make sure that these are the things that are included into our curricula. I'm reminded here of the work of Kwesi Prime. I mean, here's somebody who spent decades trying to harmonize and standardize African languages. in the Center for Advanced African Studies so that we could write in it, use it in our universities, etc., making the argument that you cannot develop on the basis of other people's languages. His work never supported by any government. So that's the one. What we do to ourselves is the question I keep asking. The second one from South Africa, I'm reminded again of this interim moment that we are in, where the old is dying and the new is not yet born, and it's really a moment of opportunity for us. And so we can begin to speak not just about epistemic injustice, but about the economic injustices, the social injustices, the emotional injustices. We can begin to raise those again. We can begin to raise issues of class, of race, etc. All that got very subsumed under this discourse of democratization and rights and diversity. It's a language and a set of variables that we're definitely bringing back to the discussion. And along reparations, reparations for me is not just about slavery. It's one component of it, but it's also about colonialism and about the post-colonial injustices that we've had to suffer. It is about climate change. It is about the conflicts that we are experiencing now. So it has an international dimension and it has a national dimension. And we have to make sure that that's part of our discussion as well.
Thank you so much. Professor Seleza, quickly, please.
Yes. So in terms of the role of universities, I think you raised a very important question. Can I encourage you to buy this book? I address a lot of these issues we are talking about. So I won't answer that one because we don't have time. But I just wanted to point out that on indigenous language, indigenous knowledges, Codesria, the conference last week at Codesria, there were two conferences. The first one was they have established the African Fellows, I forget, it's AFRIAC, the African Fellows in African Indigenous Knowledges. It's a consortium, across the continent in which, research and teaching, pedagogies, and so on indigenous languages are going to be mobilized across the continent. Let me just end with one little comment on Africa as black. This originates actually from the Hegelian principles of Africa as blank darkness. That Africa is actually three. There is the Northern Africa, which is part of Europe, the Mediterranean, which is part of, Nile, which is part of Asia, and the real Africa is ahistorical. That is the conceptual basis for how, up to today, we think of Africa in the way we do. And I think it's our role as intellectuals to point out that this is based on 19th century Eurocentric imperialist thought and organizations and institutions that claim to be interested in decolonizing. We have to begin by decolonizing geopolitics and geographies.
Thank you very much, Professor Seleza. I know we are running out of time. Just give me 1 minute to close this way. This is the only way I can bring this particular section to an end. Tell you a story from my youth, where a young man asked the oldest person in the village, "Old man, wise old man, please, can you tell me the answer to my question?" The young man had come up with a perfect way to make sure the old man would tell him the wrong answer. And the question, the scheme he came up with was, he caught a small bird, and he put the bird in his palm, and he is going to ask the old man, "Old man, please, wise old man, tell me, is the bird in my palm alive or dead?" If the old man says the bird was alive, he was going to crush it and say, "Old man, see, you don't know everything." If the old man said the bird was dead, He was going to open his palm and the bird would fly away. He would still say, old man, you don't know anything. Either way, he was going to win. So he gathered the people, as we have gathered here, and said, wise old man, please tell us, is the bird in my palm alive or dead? The old man sat back and leaned forward and said, young man, the answer you seek is in your palm. The answer you seek is in your palm. You want the bird alive, it will be alive for you. You want it dead, it will be dead for you. The Africa we want is up to us, not up to anyone else. We have to work for it. We have to collaborate. We have to source knowledge, useful knowledge, and make sure nobody tells us who we are by knowing who we are before we engage outsiders. I thank you so very much for giving us the opportunity to share this moment with you. Please help me thank my panelists, and I yield over to Ben.
A big thank you, Professor Kelechi Kalu, Professor Hendricks, Honorable Reagan Okumu, Professor Toussaint Morula, Excellency Ashraf Swellen, Professor Paul Zalesa, thank you, Jayashri Wyatt, thank you, Christina McElwenny. Let's put our hands together for them one more time, please. And a big thank you. Please, one thing, and I will give you to the Undersecretary General. If you didn't get the chance to ask your question, I am your sacrificial lamb. I didn't manage the time well, forgive me. After the meeting, come here and I'll bribe you with some coffee from the UN coffee shop and do my penance. Undersecretary General, Advisor on Africa for the UN, Christina Duarte, over to you to close us. Thank you.
Very focused. 2.5. Thank you, my dear brother. I have been given some bullet points from day 1, day 2, and day 3. But I'm not going to summarize these 3 days. It would be a huge mistake. Allow me to close this session, and I'm asking your permission, using my African policymaker mindset. I have been in the African policymaking industry, if you allow me this, for more than 20, 30 years. And maybe you understand why me and my team are promoting this. It's not my expectation, my dream is not to deliver one more UN conference. And I'd like to focus on the next steps. But allow me the challenge that I hope that you can help us solve. You remember in the first day, I mentioned in my remarks that Africa has been captured by lots of paradoxes, but there is one that is preventing us moving forward. And if you don't understand that, in 10 years' time, we'll be having the same conversation, not with me, I hope. Is the fact that Africa has been profiled by African partners in general as a continent deprived of financial resources. And by being profiled in this way, the international cooperation business model has been designed and conceived that Africa is deprived of financial resources. Worse than that, Africans, ourselves, this is our mindset, that we belong to a continent deprived of financial resources. My dear brothers, my dear sisters, completely wrong. We need to change this mindset and this starting point. This is the reason we need academics. But a very practical goal, let's say in this way. And me and my team, we put a couple of numbers on the table. Some I mentioned in my introductory remarks. But do you know that as we speak today, Africa finances its own development in more than 75%? It's not ODA, it's not FDI. African resources. Do you know that this self-financing in more than 75% is 20 times ODA and 60 times more FDI? My question is, why we keep looking outside for the solutions to our own problems? This is the question. And this is a mindset question. What is a mindset question? Or a mindset challenge? At the end of the day, what is it? It's a knowledge challenge. At the end of the day, it's a knowledge challenge. So we need to team with you. We need to team with academics, because I have been Minister of Finance for 10 years. Ask if when I was sit there, I had time to research. My concern was to get the money to pay the salaries, to pay the bills, to make sure that the school year, everything is ready to open on September 1st, to close the financial fiscal year with a deficit that the Bretton Woods would smile to me. This is our daily challenge. So, but we have in our own countries people that spend 24 hours by 7 on the knowledge. Can we get married? Can we go to some place and someone marry us? I don't know. This is the purpose of this conference. And why we policymakers?
So you're proposing.
So, I'm your side, my dear brother. We policymakers, we need your knowledge to do what? And I'm going to go through 4 pillars of a conceptual framework where, don't try, I will read your book, unless your book addresses my problems as a policymaker. Correct, Professor? I will read your book if your book addresses my problems. If it doesn't, I don't know if I'm going to read it. With all my due respect. But we need you to help us basically going through this conceptual framework with data, knowledge, analysis to fit solutions. The first pillar is to recognize, and conflict has been mentioned here, that durable peace in Africa requires sustainable development. What I'm saying, the only way to deliver durable peace in Africa is by delivering sustainable development. Don't give me short-term solutions. Band-aids will not address the root problem. Second pillar, this is a request to you academics. Second, if you agree that durable peace requires sustainable development, please agree with me that sustainable development requires sustainable financing. Yep. Sustainable development is a long-term journey, generational. We need long-term capital financing. And third, I hope you agree with me and I need your help, sustainable financing by its turn requires control over economic and financial flows. If I do not control domestic economic and financial flows, I will never be able to deliver sustainable financing. And by not delivering sustainable financing, I will not deliver sustainable development. And by not delivering sustainable development, I will not deliver durable peace. But then I ask you, academics, what do we need to control, for Africa to control its own economic and financial flows? And we go to the theme of this conference. To control, we already said sustainable finance requires control over economic and financial flows. Control over economic and financial flows requires strong and effective states, institutions, country systems. In this particular aspect, where we need you, academics, to jump, marry with us, policymakers, and trying to help us building effective states. We need to humbly recognize that after 60 years of independence, Africa still faces the nation-building challenge. And you need to recognize that. And for that, allow me to take out my Minister of Finance and put my UN officer. The UN system is getting ready. My two colleagues have made short but very looking forward interventions. Thank you very much. They are ready to help us. But more, and I will close with that. Don't close my macro, please. Are you aware that the Secretary General has rolled out a deep and important reform called UN 2.0? Are you aware of that? You know that the purpose of UN 2.0 is to change the skill set of the UN system to better serve member states, in particular African states. We start by recognizing that you have money, so there is no point to come to me ask for money. I don't have money. You have the money. African countries have the money, not the UN system. And UN system is ready to help you stop losing the money. Then comes our add value. We have data, we have knowledge, we have strong footprint, and at the end of the day, we are the most trustable multilateral institution in the multilateral arena. Thank you very much.
We thank you so much. Muito obrigado, Undersecretary General Cristina Duarte. We thank all the distinguished thought leaders, academics, professors, Chief Justice of Ghana, who's been here with us. Everybody who is here, please, on behalf of Undersecretary General Duarte and her team, please, let's put our hands together and appreciate everything that's gone on. And I repeat, if you want a reference point, all this is archived and available for you to go back to and share. Everybody online on YouTube, we have not forsaken you. We thank you. I wish all of you a very good rest of the day. We need all the distinguished panelists to come to the front for photographs. And please have a few minutes to connect with somebody. May Africa be transformed in our lifetime. Thank you.